So who are the key stakeholders in the built environment? Well, a stakeholder is a person, group, or an organisation or a system who affects or has been affected by our built environment. So or the process of changes to that environment. So effectively every one of us is a stakeholder on some level in terms of the built environment. However, some stakeholders are more influential than others. So I've given a few examples of influential stakeholders here, such as the central government, local government, private investors, public investors, state bodies or institutions, and the general public. So why are these big influencers in terms of our built environment? Well, let's take the central government, for example. Through passing legislation, they can transpose European policy into national law. So, for example, the Energy Performance Building Directive, that was a directive from Europe, required us to have nearly zero energy buildings in Ireland. And that got transposed into the Irish regulations. And that means that all new buildings built now have to be built to that regulation. It means that they have to be nearly zero energy buildings. In other words, use a very low amount of energy in terms of their operation, and that amount of energy, a significant amount of that has to come from renewable energy. They also develop, central government also develop national policy and guidance documents, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. National spatial strategy, national development plans, implementation acts and regulations like the building control, for example, health and safety legislation. So through passing legislation, the central governments have a significant influence on the built environment. They also are the biggest investor in the built environment in the country. So the government, through specific investment programs, programs that are set out in principle within the National Spatial Strategy and National Development Plan, they are going to obviously impact on the built environment, invest in the design and construction of that national infrastructure, such as broadband, such as roads, such as water infrastructure, wastewater infrastructure, and so on. Creating tax incentives, so the government can create tax incentives, and that can cause developers or investors then to invest in certain type of built environment. For example, a hotel capital allowance would encourage investors to build more houses. Car park schemes would encourage investors to build more car parks. There might be adjustment in tax relief, capital gains, tax on transfers of commercial properties or student housing or so on. So lots of different tax incentives will influence then what people might build and what they might invest in terms of the built environment. And of course, as well as tax incentives, there can be grant schemes as well that the government can also invest in. So for example, through Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland, there's several grant schemes related to sustainability. So for example, currently for a photovoltaic panel, for getting electricity from sun as a renewable energy, there's a grant for that. There's a grant for upgrading your home to make it use less energy, and so on in there. So through a grant scheme, the government can influence what we do in terms of the built environment, what's built in the built environment, and what improvements might be made in terms of the built environment. So what about local government? Well, local government at a county level or city level or an area level will create development plans for that area. So they establish what areas are developed and what areas aren't developed. So for example, it's going to set out they're going to identify what type of development is appropriate for different areas, whether it's residential, whether it's mixed, whether it's industrial, or whether it has to be a greenfield site. They establish appropriate development densities and heights for their areas. They establish areas for protection, like special areas of conservation, architectural conservation areas, protected structures, and so on. So through those development plans, then, that is going to influence what's going to be developed and therefore influence the built environment. Of course, the local government can invest in local infrastructure, such as transport infrastructure, such as water infrastructure, and so on in there. They can invest in local public development projects, so for example, a new town park, playgrounds, fire services, water sanitation services, through local planning control as well, overseeing the proper implementation of the relevant development plan, making sure that the planners are charged with overseeing implementation and drafting of plans. And of course, building control, ensuring that development meets building regulation standards, particularly, I suppose, in relation to fire and accessibility. So how are private investors then? What mode and level of impact do private investors have? So private investors being such as developers, banks, financial institutes, investment groups, and so on. So they're usually the quickest group to react to the market changes. They will only involve themselves in projects where profit can be made. So usually with a short, medium time frame, like a housing scheme or commercial developments and so on. So they can be swayed by government incentives if they can increase their profitability in there. Then what about public investors? So public investors are very different than private investors. Public investors are such as government departments, public-private partnerships, and so on. So they generally deal with projects that would not be profitable for public investors, but do not fall within the remit of local government. So, for example, government department buildings, they might have significant budget at their disposal for their own department buildings and facilities, like the Department for Health, in terms of hospitals, clinics, nursing homes, and so on. Schools, universities. So, for example, take our own university here in the National University of Ireland, Galway, can put together their own plans, can invest in their own built environment and infrastructure, whether that's new energy systems, new buildings, the realm around the university, in terms of so we can safely and pleasantly get around from one building to the other. State bodies or institutions are charged with implementing aspects of the National Development Plan. So, for example, the National Roads Authority is charged with planning and supervising roads. The ESB are charged with the electricity. CIE are charged with the rail system. RTE are the public broadcaster, and so on. Universities significant investment programs. So over 50% of all construction currently being undertaken in Galway City was happening in the campus a number of years ago, during the downturn. So that kind of shows, locally how big of a influence the university, for example, can have in terms of the local economy and the built environment. And the last, but not means least, in terms of having significant influence, is the general public. General public have a right to appeal in the planning forum. So anyone that wants to change the built environment will have to put in a plan in there to get approved, and the public have a right to appeal that. They obviously the public are going to help in terms of maintain and protect our built environment. They're able to canvass for particular facilities and infrastructure, so they can put public pressure groups in there. There's various different public pressure groups around that can canvass or put pressure on our public representatives to make sure that they're investing appropriately in the built environment. So our demands, our expectations, and our attitudes can directly impact on the physical realization of our built environment. And of course, there's now a growing awareness of energy consumption, energy efficiency, clean energy, clean air, clean waters, and so on, that are leading to more sustainable solutions.